Hi, my name is Steve Mann. I work at the Centre for Applied Linguistics at the University of Warwick. Hugh Jarvis has kindly asked me to provide a video about or related to the article that's just come out in Applied Linguistics, which is called A Critical Review of Qualitative Interviews in Applied Linguistics. So what I was trying to do in this paper is to ask a couple of questions. First of all, what can we learn from related disciplines like qualitative sociology, ethnomethodology, anthropology, and distortive psychology? What can we learn from these related disciplines? I want to draw on some of Jonathan Potter's work and look at discursive dilemmas that I think that we face when we deal with qualitative interviews. And the last part of what I tried to do in the article is to outline some parameters of sensitivity. In other words, aspects of collecting, analysing and representing qualitative data, which I think the researcher needs to be sensitive to. I think the overall message, perhaps, if there is one, is to get away from the idea of handbooks which offer checklists and do's and don'ts, and move towards more of a sensitivity in how we collect data, how our role impacts on what's co-constructed in the interview process, and what does that mean in terms of how we represent the data. And I think I'm trying to promote, along with a lot of other people, a more reflective approach to handling qualitative interviews. So that's quite a long-winded introduction. I think it's true that the qualitative interviews have a growing presence in applied linguistics, and Stephen Talmy talks about how that growth is particularly in the area of investigation of identity, experiences, people's orientations. Despite this increase in the use of qualitative interviews, they remain relatively under-theorized, although there are important contributions, and I'll try and highlight those as I talk. I guess there are some kind of worrying tendencies, and this is something that I think other people who supervise PhDs in applied linguistics feel too. That sometimes when you read a thesis, or indeed a dissertation at MA level, you sometimes get the impression that it's rather like journalism, that selected voices have been arranged in a kind of convenient or appealing order, that there is sometimes a lack of transparency. There's not enough detail about the context in which these interviews happened and how questions were asked. Because of this, I think there's a critical dimension that's missing. There's no shortage of writing about qualitative interviews in social sciences, but the vast majority tend to be in handbooks, perhaps one chapter. If you go to the Applied Linguistics site and find the article that I've written, you'll also find a supplementary document. It's a Word doc which has a full rundown, or at least a fuller rundown than in the article, of handbooks and places which you can find resources about qualitative interviewing. So I think there's no shortage of stuff out there, and there's usually one chapter in general introductions. If you take, for example, Denzin and Lincoln, which would be a standard text. In some ways, qualitative interviews are all around us. They're ubiquitous, and Benny and Hughes for example, see modern sociology as the science of the interview. Charles Briggs has a well-travelled claim that 90% of social science pieces of work, articles, rely on the interview. Atkinson and Silverman claim, and I think, perhaps not very controversially, that the interview is embedded in contemporary culture. We see them all around us on chat shows, Radio 4, 5 Live, various places. We grow up with and see and experience interviews. And this has a couple of important effects which Briggs and Silverman point to. This kind of ubiquity desensitizes the researcher to the forms and expectations of the interview. This is something that Charles Briggs talks about quite a lot. In qualitative sociology, there are important contributions. Cicero and Silverman, their idea of the interview as social encounter, that there's something social about it. Holstein and Gubrium have a lot of contributions, but one of the most simple and perhaps most effective is the idea of theorizing the interview with a hyphen in the middle. Interview. It's an exchange somehow of views, that interviews are inevitably active. So this idea of the active interview is very important, and its importance lies in recognizing that the interviewer makes a contribution to the co-construction of the interview. This is not just a case of mining or extracting information from the hapless interviewee. And that co-construction, I think, needs to be explicitly acknowledged. It doesn't matter how formalized, how structured, restricted or standardized the interview is. Holstein and Gubrium, 1995, will say that the interaction between the interview participants happens whether it's standardized or not. And I think one of the get-outs, I think, for people working with qualitative research interviews is to say they're semi-structured and leave it at that. But really that isn't enough, because we want to know a little bit more about in what way they are semi. When do we bring more control? When do we let that control go? When are we happy to allow the interviewee to develop themes, to develop ideas, and our role is primarily facilitative and supportive. So I think what I'm trying to do in the article is to look at other work that's happened in the field, people like Charles Briggs in anthropology, very influential. But I also don't want to give you the impression that everything in anthropology is rosy. Charles Briggs says there's seldom sustained focus on interviews in anthropology. It's something he says in 2007. There's important work in ethnomethodology, which I think has highlighted successfully the interactive construction of interviews. People like Hardy Sachs, Whittaker and Whiffett, Baker, their work's important and worth looking at. I want to turn to discursive psychology because I think that this work, which arises out of social psychology in a discursive term, has established some interesting perspectives on the qualitative interview. People like Edwards and Potter, Charles Antaki, they all have presented the concerns of discursive psychology in reference to concerns with the interview. What are these concerns? Well, I think key to this literature is concern with linguistic features of identity, positioning, stake, role, how these things play out in interviews. discursive psychology tends to draw on traditions of CA in making its contribution, and I think Potter and Hepburn provide strong arguments that interviews should be studied as an interactional object in their own right. Now, Potter and Hepburn, and this is where I think I've drawn specifically on their work, draw attention to contingent problems with interviewing. These are things that you can do something about. They also highlight problems that you can't do anything about, but I think I wanted to work particularly with the contingent problems, things that you can think about. The first of these is the deletion of the interviewer. The interviewer somehow is not present in the analysis and representation. And this issue of deletion goes into problems with the representation of the interaction, that we never see the terms of, or if we never see the terms of the interviewer. There are also problems if the way that the interview is set up, where it takes place, on what basis of the interviewee being recruited. Issues of setup are important. And they also point to the failure to consider interviews as interaction. So in terms of co-construction, you can point to Cicero, Silverman, Briggs, Holstein and Gubrian, Mischler, and they've all established, I think, that interview talk is co-constructed, and that we need to recognise that and take account of it. So an interview has, by definition, two contributing participants. It's an interview. And people like Atkinson and Silverman have highlighted, I think, for us the problem of regarding the interviewee as some kind of self-revealing, confessional participant. Someone who is there to be mined and to extract the truth from. It's inevitably a co-construction. And so people like Shrikant Sarangi have said we need more work which recognises that the interviewee and interviewer co-construct what happens in that space. And people like Tim Rapley, David Block, Kathy Ralston, Stephen Tolmie, Keith Richards. There are a growing number, Anita Pavlenko, to name another one. These are all people who I think have problematized this issue and pointed to the need for more recognition of this co-construction. One person I would like to mention particularly, I think it's worth looking at, is Kathy Ralston, and her book, The Reflective Interviewing, is particularly worth looking at. And her work has always seen the interview as a co-construction. She uses terms like co-categorical incumbency to look at how the basis on which someone's recruited, if they're a geography teacher, and the role of the interviewer, if they're also a geography teacher, then these things have an impact on understanding and co-construction. A good example, I think, that recognises how the interviewer affects the interview would be Sue Garton and Fiona Copland's article, which I referenced, which looks at how often interviewees are friends, they're acquaintances, and how does that acquaintance, that friendship, play out in the interview. What I'm suggesting is that we need to, in writing articles and presenting our work, in presenting our dissertations and thesis, we need to take more account of how in an interview, one sequence is linked to the next. Any utterance or point of view, belief or anecdote will inevitably arise from preceding discourse. This interactional context is something that Anita Pavlenko talks about. She says there's too much emphasis on content and little attention to the forms and contexts of construction. And she says that we ignore the interactional influences on the presentation of self. And there's an echo there, I think, with the Silverman idea of being suspicious of this self-revealing self, that somehow these ideas and truths and beliefs existed in some simplistic way previous to the interview. So Tim Rapley says that interview contributions are always produced in interaction with the interviewer, and transcripts should always be presented in the context in which they occurred. I think there's a problem with space, isn't there, where it's not always possible to show all your transcripts in the full context, but if you never do it, then there's an issue. So what I try to do in the article is to highlight some examples of good practice and highlight some examples where in TESOL Quarterly and Applied Linguistics and other journals, claims are made about recognizing the importance of co-construction, but we don't see it as readers. Perhaps talking about particular strategies that were used by the interviewer, and we don't see it. We don't see any transcript. And I guess I'm making a subsidiary argument here, is that if there's space, then we see the transcripts. If there's not space, then is there any way of putting those online? Of course, if we have necessary permissions and there are no ethical issues. But when we get permission, if possible, we can get permission so that other people can see a fuller account. And I think this is important for two reasons. The first one is transparency. People being able to see whether there is anything selective in our choices, to see whether the interviewer has in some way influenced what is said. Of course they will, but it needs to be recognised. And the other reason is to do with the training of relatively novice researchers. And it's important because if those of us that have more experience in qualitative interviewing don't share that experience and open up that process, showing more of the how rather than a sole concentration on the what, then it's all the more difficult to become proficient and reflective in the process of qualitative interviewing. So I think that's about all I've got to say. I'd like to show you a short interview now that I did the other day with a student, Mikio, from Japan, who I think discovered when he presented his data that one of the participants didn't agree with the way that he had presented the data. And I think it's things like checking the transcript, perhaps checking some of the things that you're saying with the original interviewee that create this sense of dialogue, which I think can help you be reflective. I think it's important to show some transcription. I would be suspicious of an article which claimed to be qualitative, claimed to recognise some elements of co-construction, but we didn't see any sign of interviewer questions. So finally, let me pass over to Mikio and the interview I did with him the other day. Thanks for listening. I hope this has been helpful. I hope the article is in some way useful in helping us to be more reflective about our practice. Okay, Mikio, as you know, I'm interested at the moment in the way that interview data is represented, and particularly whether the interviewer is present in the data, and interview data tends to get mined and presented in monologue, and I think that you've got an interesting story that maybe you can share with us about this. First of all, though, could you give us a little bit of background, just in in a few sentences, about what the research topic is, and about this interviewer who kind of objected to the way that you'd represented his data?
Sure. I'm doing a narrative case study, a qualitative research on the Japanese people living and studying in England. And I'm doing a longitudinal study of how their identity changes and how their motivation fluctuates during their stay in England. And I presented data. I did internal data presentation, and my participant came.
So you had already interviewed him before?
Yes.
And how long was that interview?
Well, I did 3 interviews spanning a year. Each interview, it exceeded 60 minutes, so quite a long interview.
Okay, and you were giving a presentation in which the person that you'd been interviewed was in the audience.
Yes.
And you showed a few PowerPoints basically representing what you took to be his voice.
Yes, what I took to be his voice.
Okay, so can you take it up from there?
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about what you put on the PowerPoint and why you think he objected to it.
Well, I was surprised that he objected to my data presentation, because I just followed the norms of the standard, whatever I saw in research articles, whatever I saw in conference presentations, because normally an individual's voice is summarized as a monologue, so I just thought I'll just follow the convention.
And what exactly did you think he objected to?
Well, one of the things he told me was I was dramatizing events, and for him the biggest problem seemed to be that for the way I presented his voice, it was too clear without his hedges or his corrections or his hesitations. So it made the voice rather sounding as if he clearly stated something, and that I am using it to support my argument.
So his main comments were about the lack of, say, hesitations or hedging in his voice. Do you think he had any concerns about the fact that you weren't present at all as interviewer?
Well, that actually he didn't point it out directly, but in order to represent what actually went on in the interviews, I thought I was responsible, because through the research methodology chapter, when I was doing my research methodology chapter, I often came across co-construction or co-authoring, and I thought, wait a minute, where is my role if I'm also responsible in creating his voice?
And do you think, if you take this as something of a critical incident for you, where you were kind of initially surprised, but it taught you something, or you learned, you became more aware of that the co-construction, to represent that in some way, at least occasionally, is important? Do you think that's a learning point for you?
Oh, it was a great learning point, because it was a wake-up call, because I thought, well, other people are doing it, why can't I? And I talked to my supervisor, and well, she actually advised me, if I am to present data in my thesis, I should actually put my voice there. But then I thought, wait a minute, people are not doing it. But then when I thought about this problem logically, I thought all the keywords like co-construction, co-authoring, or discursive construction, I thought I should put my voice in so that it is loyal to his words, including his hesitation or his hedgings.
Okay, and in terms of the way that you're representing your data and perhaps this piece of data in your thesis now, in you're writing up your thesis at the moment, how much space do you think you're now giving to representing both your voice and the researchee's voice and this kind of co-construction?
Yeah. This is a difficult point because my interviewees don't respond directly to my question. In fact, after several lines, they might answer my question, or they might just say something different, but which could be very valuable for my thesis. So I decided at least to include what my questions were, and then how my interviewee responded. Even if they haven't answered straight after my question, I would include what kind of topics I brought up or what kind of question I brought. So I try to include my roles as much as possible.
When you say you include your roles and your voice, is that the actual thing that you said, or is it a summarized version?
Sometimes it's summarized. As I said, if they answered like 3 minutes later, then I obviously cannot include all the 3-minute discussion. So I just say, when I asked him this question, he later came up with this answer. But if he answers directly, yes, I would put my questions. I would even include my noddings, and I would even include some of the words or comments that I made.
Okay, Mikio, a while back you were talking about Joji and him objecting to your PowerPoint presentation of the data, and it sounds as though that made you more reflexive, made you more aware of what you were bringing to the interview. Do you want to say anything more about that?
Yes. That I have to be loyal to the participants' voices, and that I am also responsible as a co-author of someone who's co-constructing data. And then I realized in the next round of interviews, I was being very aware that whatever questions or the comments I make will be on the thesis, so I became very selective. Like, as I was interviewing, I was also thinking, how is this going to be presented in my paper?
Okay, Mikio, thanks very much for coming and talking about your data today. Very interesting. Good luck with finishing it.
Yeah, hopefully.
Okay, so once again, thanks very much, and thanks to Mikio for sharing some time to share with us some of his insights into his process of interview. Thanks, and see you soon. Bye.